Would you like to sit me down in a corner and ask me all your questions about property? Well, that's what Liz and Marc did from finder.com.au, and today you're going to be able to hear my insights.
Are you interested in property investing, success or money? Well, you're in the right place. This is the Michael Yardney podcast, where each week you'll learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in 20 minutes or less. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, who has once again been voted Australia's leading property investment advisor. That's the fourth time he's won a similar award in the last 6 years.
Today, you're going to get what I call an insider's guide into what's happening in the property markets. Because earlier this year, Liz and Marc, who run the finder.com.au podcast, sat me down and asked me all their questions about what's going to drive our markets, how they're affected, what beginning property investors should do, what more experienced property investors should do. So today's episode is going to be a bit longer because I didn't know what bits to cut out. When I heard this podcast, I asked permission to allow you, my listeners, to listen to it on my show because there was so much gold. So welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. And as you listen in, you're going to hear about the major forces driving our property markets, effect of APRA on our property lending and what I see as ahead, where I see interest rates heading, how rising interest rates may actually make it easier for some investors than others, what I see happening moving ahead with property price growth, a bit about the infrastructure boom, my advice on dealing with property advertisements, learning a bit about how spruikers work, population growth. Boy, did they ask me lots of questions. The list goes on and on. So sit back and enjoy this week's show as Marc and Liz from finder.com.au grill me about my insights into the property markets and how they work.
Okay, so today we have a favourite guest of the podcast, and coming back for the second time, Michael Yardney. Michael is an expert in property. There's just a huge list of achievements and titles. So yeah, without further ado, welcome to the show.
Fantastic to be back. Thanks for asking me to come again.
So Michael, we thought that today would be an awesome episode to chat about property in 2018. So property has just been in the news, like you can't go an hour without seeing a new story, I think. And there's been doom and gloom, there's been bubbles bursting, all kinds of stuff. Just high level, what can we expect in 2018?
Well, look, as you say, in the car on the way here, the Uber driver asked me, "What do you do?" And as soon as he found out, the Uber drivers know all about property too, and they ask all the questions about it and wanted to know what's going on.
Did you lie to him?
So what's happening at the market at the moment is it's catching its breath. It's definitely moved to the next phase of the cycle, but it's not the doom and gloom that you're hearing in the headlines that you're seeing splashed across the media.
Yeah, well, that's good to know, I suppose, because I just bought a property.
Well done. And when you look back in 5 years' time, when you look back in 10 years' time, you're going to say, boy, was that cheap. Look, we've had 5 years of soaring property prices, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. And I believe moving forward into 2018, we're going to have mixed results. But we've had fragmented markets for the last 5, 10, in fact, forever. Also, the different stages of Australia's property market are different stages of their own cycle. But 2017 produced really strong results in Melbourne, Canberra, Hobart, and it actually confounded a lot of the experts who 12 months ago made their predictions for 2017. So some of the markets did particularly well. Sydney ran out of steam, but overall it still did 5% capital growth, double what inflation did. So looking forward, I see a number of outside influences that are going to make a difference to what happens to our markets.
Okay, yeah, and that's actually interesting what you just mentioned about forecasts and things like that often being wrong. I actually read an article on your site which kind of went through some previous forecasts and actually what ended up happening after that. So I think definitely you need to take that with a grain of salt, right?
Well, it's interesting. I think meteorologists and weather forecasters get a better result of the weather than property forecasters do, because the property market has multiple drivers, and it's not just the fundamentals. So we can have a plan about what interest rates are going to do and what APRA is going to do, but every year there's an X factor. Every year there's a couple of X factors, things that, not the TV show, the musical X factor.
There's that too, though. That never ends.
It's the unexpected thing that either works on the upside for the positive to make the markets work better, or the downside and makes them go down. And that's local X factors and also international ones affecting our markets in general. So they're the reasons why all the best predictions, forecasts made at the beginning of the year get messed up along the way.
So what do you see as some of the major affecting factors that are, really going to have some driving forces on property prices in 2018?
Well, I think what the Reserve Bank does with interest rates and what APRA does with finance is going to be one of the biggest factors. If you think about it, residential real estate is a game of finance with some properties thrown in the middle. And APRA and the Reserve Bank have slowed down our booming Sydney and Melbourne property markets. And they've done it right this time. They've done it in a reasonably low interest rate environment. In the past, the way every cycle that boomed was stopped, well, since regulation anyway, deregulation, I should say, of the banking sector, every cycle was stopped by rising interest rates. 2011, the interest rate, 2010 interest rates rose only 0.75% rises. The market stopped. Happened in 2008. It happened in 2002, 3. Happened in the 1990s. So what happens is the Reserve Bank, when we get ahead of ourselves with property, slowed us down, but they did it by pushing up interest rates, which put some people into mortgage default, some people into mortgage stress, some businesses had difficulty borrowing to employ more people, buy new equipment. So this time they've done it by making it harder to get loans, by making it harder to get interest-only loans, by making good banking practices to make sure that you've got responsible lending. And on that basis, it slowed us down in a relatively low interest rate environment, which means that there's not going to be much mortgage default. It means businesses can borrow, buy new equipment, employ new people. So the Reserve Bank and APRA have done a really good job. And as long as they leave us alone this year, and I think they will, then other factors are going to affect the market. But they're the two big ones that could make a change.
And what are your thoughts on price growth? So obviously that is the big question that a lot of investors will have, what is going to happen to price growth? What are your thoughts on that heading into 2018?
Well, I think the phenomenal growth we had in Sydney and Melbourne have come to an end. We've had 5 years of double-digit growth at a time when inflation was less than 2%, when wages growth was minimal, if at all, in many industries, and where economic growth was low. And so the market's got a little bit ahead of themselves, and on that basis, that was unsustainable. So it's going to vary from state to state, and I am happy to give you some predictions, but should we leave those a little bit later in the podcast and tease our listeners to make sure they keep listening?
Definitely. So the next thing that we wanted to kind of touch on for 2018 is interest rates. So like you said, APRA and the role of the RBA and things like that do have a big impact on where prices will head. So what do you think will happen?
Well, the official RBA interest rate is now 1.5%. It's been that way throughout 2017, and I believe it's going to remain much the same in 2018. The Reserve Bank has a mandate to keep inflation under control and to help boost the economy, and it really only has one main lever to pull, and that's interest rates. But Australia's economy is currently performing below its potential. Economic growth isn't as strong as the Reserve Bank or any of us would like it to be. So it's not strong enough to justify an interest rate increase. The only reason the Reserve Bank is going to raise interest rates is when inflation goes up and it's going to slow it down, when the property market booms again and it's going to try and slow it down. And that's not in the foreseeable future. Sure, we're making jobs, and we're actually creating more jobs and more full-time jobs, and that's really, really important that they are full-time jobs, but wages growth is slow, retail sales are sluggish, we've got a benign inflationary environment, so there's no reason for the Reserve Bank to raise rates. If anything, they'd like to lower them.
Interesting.
But they're not, to push us along,
right,
to make us work better, to make the economy work better, because if money is cheaper...
More people will borrow. Yeah.
But they don't want them to borrow for property. Fortunately, the Reserve Bank is going to be happy that our property markets are cooling, so it won't feel the need to raise interest rates. It would like to lower them, but can't because it would encourage us to buy again. So I believe interest rates are going to remain much the same. And I know every month Finder.com.au speaks to a whole list of experts, and I think... And thank you for having me as part of that team.
Yep.
And I think very much the feeling amongst all of those is that interest rates will remain steady for most of 2018, but probably the next move is going to be up.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's sort of good news for people who are looking to get into the property market, though, because I know as someone who's very much outside of the property market, it is quite terrifying, because the interest rates are so low right now, but if they were to raise them, it just makes it, so much more unattainable to get in there.
Okay, well, let's talk about that, because interest rates aren't going to jump magnificently.
It's 7% now.
No. What's going to happen is the Reserve Bank has always made them go up in little lumps of 0.25%. It's actually happened over the last year anyway. Investors are paying a little bit more than owner-occupiers.
Right.
People who are having interest-only loans are paying a little bit more. So that's already happened. The banks have crept up a little bit anyway. But in the past, it's taken 2 or at the most 3 0.25% interest rate rises to stop the markets, to slow the economy. So I can't see interest rates getting to... Well, we're talking about the Reserve Bank rates may go from 1.5% to 2.25%, and therefore your and my bank loans may also go up 1/4, 1/2, 3/4%, not to unsustainable levels, because no one wants... The banks don't want us to lose our homes. The banks don't want us to not be able to pay our mortgages, neither does the Reserve Bank. The banking industry is underpinned by residential lending.
And for those who maybe don't really know how a rising interest rate will affect the property market, maybe, Michael, you could just quickly explain. So interest rates go up. Why does this make it sometimes easier for someone who's looking to enter the market at that time?
Well, the Reserve Bank sets interest rates dependent upon the things we spoke about a while ago, about what inflation's doing and what the economy is doing, what unemployment is doing or employment growth is doing, to encourage our economy to move along steadily, comfortably, but not too fast. It's currently in a stimulatory interest rate environment. In other words, it believes the low interest rates, the 1.5% Reserve Bank rate, is helping stimulate the economy. Now, that's not the rate you and I borrow at. It's the interbank rate, and then the banks take some of the money from other banks, some from deposits from mums and dads, some from term deposits, some from overseas money, and they also have to put their margin on. So therefore, interest rates vary considerably depending upon the bank's cost of money and the bank's appetite for new business. So there is quite a variation on what you can pay. And that's one of the great things about finder.com.au. You can go online and you can see quite a wide variation. And it's interesting how many people don't, do they?
Right, yeah.
They just accept what they're told. Yeah. They don't even... I read a great blog that you guys came up with recently that most people don't even ask for a reduction in the interest rate.
I know. Yeah, it's isn't it crazy that like literally all you have to do is just hop on a site, see what else is out there and just ask, can you do better? Or can I've been a loyal customer, can you reduce my rate?
The worst thing they'll say is no.
Exactly. I love rejection.
You're used to it in life.
Exactly.
So to answer your question, the banks are going to charge a different interest rate, and there's 2 elements to it. Partly is the psychological element, but the other is the serviceability. So the psychological element, I've got to pay more for my money, but in fact, the banks want to make sure you can afford to. But 1/4%, 0.5% isn't going to make your repayments unsustainable, or if they are, you've actually overcommitted yourself. But interestingly, there's the psychological element of all of a sudden interest rates are going up, what's happening, I'm not sure, and people just sit back and hold on for a little while to decide what to do. So that's all it is. That's what tends to happen, and every time interest rates have gone up, it has stopped the market over a 3 to 6 month period. It happens pretty quickly.
Wow. I have a question. So obviously,
You're allowed to because you're the podcast host.
Ask away, Liz.
Yeah, I'll ask if I can ask the question. So obviously, there's been a lot of moves to kind of reduce the amount of people getting loans who, if there was an interest rate rise, that simply couldn't afford them. But surely there's people who have had mortgages, for 20 years, and if there was an interest rate rise, maybe they wouldn't be able to afford them. What happens in that situation?
That's interestingly not the case, because the statistics show that most homeowners are ahead in their mortgage payment.
Okay.
And remember, they've also got considerable equity because the value of their properties has gone up. So let's talk about the two separate things. Existing homeowners, many of them have, as the last couple of years as interest rates have dropped, have kept up their monthly payments the same. And on that basis, they've actually got, they're ahead in their payments. So it's unlikely there's going to be a problem. In the past, the worst time I remember really high interest rates was in the early 1990s. And when people couldn't make their payments, what the banks did was extend their 25-year loans to 30-year loans. The banks didn't want to take possession of your home, kick you out, be on the front of the paper or in current affair, putting people on the streets. So what they did was say, okay, well, we'll extend the term of your loan to make the repayments easier for you.
Okay, wow. Good guy banks.
Yeah. But I suppose that's true. Like they almost have a bit of a vested interest in not seeing you kicked out of your house as well, because they want you to keep paying your loan.
And also
much more than a bit of a vested interest because they don't want your property to put on the market. So if you look at regional towns and mining towns, really interestingly, a couple of months ago, Pam and I went on vacation to Exmouth, which is top north of Western Australia, and it was a town that has now got some great places to look at for tourism, but was in the past based on the mining industry, and a third of the properties are for sale. They've all got for sale signs at the front, but the banks didn't take them over. The people who bought those properties are now stuck with them, but the bank, as long as they're keeping up the mortgage payments,
Right.
are not going to take possession because they don't want to get stuck with all those properties and try and sell them.
Right.
Yeah.
So the bank has a vested interest, as not a little interest, a very serious interest in making sure the residential market is doing okay. What's happened in the past, though, is there were some, let's call them interesting lending practices where not only banks, but some brokers were just a little bit they turned a blind eye to some of the mortgage applications. So some people who maybe weren't borrowing responsibly were overcommitting themselves. And I've seen that with people who bought 8, 9 properties at 90% loan to value ratio, overstating what their incomes are, understating what their expenses are. And it all goes well when everything's okay, but it goes pear-shaped when things change. So over the last little while, APRA has made sure the bank's lending criteria are more responsible. If anything, they stress test lending to make sure that you can't only borrow today's interest rate, but it's 7.5% or 8%. As well as that, they also want to make sure that you could pay the extra if it was a principal interest loan. They're not suggesting you are ever going to have to pay 7.5%. They're not saying you are going to have to pay principal interest, but they're wanting to make sure that you could, if you had to. That's a stress test. And so if you can't pass that, at the moment, they're just not lending you the money.
Right. Yeah, it is changing a lot when it comes to
Yeah. And it was that big scandal about the liar loans as well.
Yes, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was talking about. I called them interesting lending criteria, but some of them were fraudulent. Some people were not declaring everything on their loan applications, and some mortgage brokers, I guess, were turning a blind eye to it. And that's not helping their clients. It's actually putting people into the position where one day they will get caught out financially. And that happens at the end of every cycle, that some people just overcommit themselves.
Yeah.
Human nature.
Right. Okay, so you sort of mentioned before, Michael, that APRA isn't expected to do anything over 2018. And if they don't, then that might be a good thing for property investment.
Well, APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority's job is to regulate the banking system and make it safe, because we could have gone down the same route as America and much of Europe in 2007, 8, 9 during the global financial crisis, because we were also having some very interesting lending practices where there was no doc loans, low doc loans. So no documentation. You didn't have to prove anything. You just had to turn up and sign a loan document.
Wow.
And in those days, if that would have continued, we would have gone the same route as overseas.
So it definitely was easier to get a home loan back in the day.
Much easier. You just had to fill out a form online half the time, some of the time.
Oh my gosh.
Very, very, very easy. So APRA's making sure the banks are doing responsible lending, A, to protect us, but B, to protect the banking system, because that's very, very important. It has done its job. It has slowed down the markets. It has slowed down interest-only lending. Their concern with interest-only lending was the concept that you weren't repaying any debt and hoping that the increased equity in your property would be worth more than the interest you're paying each month. In other words, that you'd be getting ahead. And if you bought in Sydney, if you bought in Melbourne, if you bought in Canberra, even if you bought in Hobart last year, you would be okay. But if you'd bought in some of the other cities, you actually wouldn't be. And so now they're wanting to make sure that you're actually paying down some of the principal as well. And it's actually got the banking system into a good position at the moment. So I can't see it wanting to or needing to increase the restrictions. But in my mind, it's still a little bit early for it to loosen things.
Yeah, so you kind of mentioned a few different cities there. I kind of wanted to get your ideas about, different markets and things like that, and, where people should be keeping their eyes on.
Okay. If you're thinking about buying a home, that's very different. If you're thinking about property investment, you're really wanting to look at where things are going to be 3, 4, 5 years down the track. You've got to actually have a long-term perspective, not a short-term perspective, because hotspots become not spots very, very quickly.
Yes.
But at this time of the year, a lot of people are making their predictions for the next hotspots. You see it in the magazines, you see it online, and it grabs the headlines. And I'd rather be boring. Throw away the crystal ball. Look at, first of all, past growth. Not that past growth is a guarantee of future growth, but look at what the drivers of future property growth are. And the drivers of future property growth are basically economic growth, which creates jobs growth, which brings people in, which brings population who need to rent or need to buy. And eventually, if they're the right sort of jobs, it's actually going to give wages growth so people can afford to buy property. So we're not looking for affordable properties because they're cheap. We're looking for properties where people have got good incomes because they can afford to and want to and are prepared to buy. So over the last year, more than 335 jobs were created in Australia, and Australia's golden run on jobs growth is unlikely to be cut back in the next couple of years. So that's going to underpin the markets. But those jobs are being created predominantly in New South Wales, call it Sydney, Victoria, in particular Melbourne, and they've got about 3/4 of the jobs growth, and then Brisbane as well now. And those jobs are being created by private industry, but interestingly, our state governments are creating a lot of the jobs by infrastructure spending. And that's good. So years ago, there was the mining boom creating jobs. And as the mining boom cut out, the government encouraged the high-rise construction boom we've seen in all our capital cities by lowering interest rates. So a lot of the people who worked in the mining industry then went into high-rise construction, and we know that's coming to an end now. So what they're now doing is making tunnels. Look at just outside your offices there with all the infrastructure of you call it light rail. In Melbourne we call it a tram. We know what it is.
Melbourne has a few more light rails than we will have.
So there's huge in Queensland. There's Queen's Wharf. There's another runway to the airport. In New South Wales they talk about another airport as well. This is good spending. This is going to leave a legacy for the future. So infrastructure spending is good. Queensland did it really well a number of years ago when they built all the tunnels before the population growth. So as its population is growing, the legacy of previous governments is now paying off, and people can get around Brisbane really, really quickly. So it's creating short-term jobs, so people who've got income feel good, buy TVs and iPhones and houses, and so it makes the economy go around. But it's also leaving a long-term legacy. So the infrastructure boom is what's going to drive our economic growth, population growth and property growth. So have a look at where that's happening. That doesn't mean you actually have to buy properties right where infrastructure is happening, but those states in particular are going to be the eastern states of Australia.
Okay. Eastern states. So you've done okay, Mark.
Yeah. I didn't buy in, I don't know, somewhere on
nowhere.
In the middle.
With no road.
Sure. So it's population growth that creates demand, but wages growth, jobs growth, affordability, again, not because it's cheap, but because you've got wages and lowish interest rates, that's going to transfer the demand to actually purchasing, and then locally supply and demand. Big picture, the economy, state-wise, jobs, local supply and demand.
I've seen lots of different sort of ads for different cities and buying investment properties in different cities. Should you be worried about those kind of ads? Should be looking at those kind of ads? Like, I never know what to think when I kind of see those.
Well, the property investment industry is not regulated. The share market is, the financial markets are, financial planning industry is. Part of the Metropole Group, my group, is a financial planning company, and that arm is very, very strongly regulated. Even I can't put the word independent on that website. We're giving independent advice, even though I believe we are. So very, very strongly regulated. On the other side of our group of companies, the real estate arm, anyone can get up and give any sort of advice and put any sort of ads in. Many, many years ago, I was one of the foundation members of PIPA, the Property Investment Professionals of Australia, which has been for a long time calling for regulation of the property industry. So the people who are advertising that you're looking at and that come into your and my inbox are often the arms of developers. And interestingly, over the last couple of months, I've been throwing out old copies of Australian Property Investor magazine from years ago and Your Investment Property magazine. And it's fascinating as I just flick through them to see who was advertising, where they were suggesting, who the gurus were then, because, boy, most of them are not around anymore. There's only 3 or 4 people who were around 10 years ago who are still around now and who have had a consistent good track record. And so when you look, there was all the mining towns and all sorts of places that I've never heard of then and you don't hear of anymore now. So you've got to be really, really careful who you listen to, Liz.
That's a really interesting point. Like, I think we have such a short-term memory because of the volume of news that comes out every day. And then so you might not look at what was being said 5-10 years ago and see, did that actually end up panning out? Or, does that town exist anymore?
Well, one of the really interesting ones was in 2002. So Australian Property Investor magazine, that's since gone defunct, first came out in 2001. And I got all the issues. And in 2002, somebody had made a prediction of what was going to happen 10 years on in Melbourne, 2012. Now it's 2018, and it was really interesting to see how a lot of those predictions panned out. And I guess me, with my grey hair and having been doing this for 40 years, you get a level of perspective that younger people just haven't got. And it comes from the failures I've had. So I'm only as successful as I am because I've failed more often than most and just got up one more time. So I've seen it all, I've heard it all. So when the latest, newest hotspot or trend or app comes out, I think, I've seen it. No, it's not right. It doesn't work that way.
Yes.
Predicting 10 years ahead, you'd have to be very, very confident in your predictions because a lot can happen in 10 years. We could have another GFC. I mean, it's just impossible to predict.
Exactly.
But that's what you have to think about if you're going to be a property investor, because you don't want the short-term growth because it's too hard to get in and out. Sorry, I'm not saying you don't want the short-term growth, but that's not what you should be chasing. You want the sort of property that's going to be in continuous strong demand by a wide range of people, a decade away, 2 decades away. That's much more important.
Yeah, and I remember our last chat where we were talking about all the kind of things you need to look for and what you were just mentioning then. And I suppose, what you were saying, if you focus on those, then you really can find that property that will have that long-term growth.
No argument. So it's not the property, it's the location. So a lot of people do it the wrong way around. They find a property, think, oh, I like that. I've just gone for an open inspection. That's fun. And then they work backwards, and you can make the figures stack up and work by looking at statistics. So you've got to go from a top-down approach. Which state's going to do well in the long term? And then within that state, what locations? And a lot of that has to do with demographics, the people that are there, so the gentrifying areas. When we first started our office in Sydney 10 years ago, we started encouraging our clients to invest in the inner west. You could buy a 2-bedroom apartment in Marrickville for $280, less than $300,000.
Oh my gosh,
less than $300,000.
Makes me upset.
And it was hard to encourage people to do that because it was a lower socioeconomic area,
right?
And it was going through transition, and the shops weren't that great there yet. But we had the 10-year future plan of seeing what's happening, and it was gentrifying, and people were moving in and doing up the properties, and the sort of people were the hipsters. When I was young, there wasn't that sort of expression around, and so they were people with good incomes. And then the cafes came, and the other nice shops came around, and then other people like them came. And gentrification takes 20, 25 years. It hasn't finished yet, so it's a longish period. And it's happened in the inner rings of Melbourne and Sydney in particular. The next wave of gentrification is going to be the middle ring suburbs, where the houses are now, even though they're not that old, getting past the use-by date because the land's too valuable, and people are going to want to live in townhouses, in duplexes, big accommodation on more compact blocks. So, again, look, you've got to look forward, long-term, 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah. I would love to live in like a little townhouse. It'd be amazing. I've lived in an apartment for so long now. I just, whenever I visit a house, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's just, I'm on the ground. Yeah, it's amazing.
Okay, so we just capped off jobs growth. So, Michael, you think jobs growth will continue and strong population growth? What do you see as?
Well, more people want to come to Australia than are allowed to come into Australia, and they're coming here because we're politically safe, we're economically stable. People can get anyone who wants a job can get a job. Maybe not the job they want, but there are jobs around, and they're coming to Melbourne and Sydney in particular. Then you had Queensland gets about 11% of the population, 12% of the population growth, and then the rest of Australia only has about 12% for all of the rest of Australia. Interestingly, our population growth, 55% of it is immigration, and the people who are coming from overseas are coming because they've got job prospects, they've got the right knowledge, and also they're coming in general in household formation age. So it's not just population, it's household formation. How many households need accommodation? So first of all, the locals, the Australians, are getting older, and so therefore there's more 1 and 2 people households.
Right.
So therefore you need more accommodation for just the same number of people. Younger people are getting married later, living on their own, single. So again, it's how many households you require. And then the people coming from overseas are at the stage where they're young, having families, mainly in late 20s, middle 30s, is the big bulk of the population. The bulk of them are interestingly coming from India and China as well. So that's going to underpin our property requirements. But the Australian Bureau of Statistics measures permanent population growth. But recently a report came out from UBS which talked also about temporary population growth, which is not residents, but temporary residents, the students. And if you add those to the permanent population growth, it's almost double. So you just walk through your city, my city, and you'll see lots of students from Asia. And if we get it right, a lot more tourists are going to come as well. There's not population growth. But all the statistics suggest that population growth is going to continue, and that's going to underpin our property markets. That's going to be good for our economy, but it's going to create a lot of social and other issues. Public transport issues is a big one. When cities get to 5 million people, it's said that they're often unmanageable, and Sydney's there, Melbourne's getting there. So that's the importance of getting the right infrastructure. So how we live is going to have to change. So I know, Liz, you said you don't like apartments, but if you lived in Manhattan, if you lived in London, if you lived in Paris, you wouldn't even think about it.
No, I know.
That's all there is.
I know.
And we are now changing.
Yeah.
Sydney has Manhattan.
Yeah. It's so hard when you live in so I live in a suburb which is half of it is brand new apartments and the other half is the beautiful little townhouses. So you have to walk past the townhouses from the station to get to the big new apartments, and they're brand new apartments, so they're lovely. But I mean, you just can't help wanting to live in those little houses.
Right.
They are
Yeah.
cool.
And I guess my message is, don't compare your chapter 1 to somebody's chapter 40. Your parents' first house was not the same house they are now, but a lot of people move out hoping to get the same accommodation with a media room and air conditioning.
Yeah, exactly.
And all that it took their parents 40 years to get.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
We just want everything now.
Yeah, I'm
really
demanding.
Greedy young people.
Yeah, we are very greedy.
Typical millennials.
Okay, cool. So, so you think population growth will probably continue? Strong population growth.
The answer is the government can control it because they can turn the tap on or off if they want to. And there has been times when they have turned it off by restricting it. So they're not going to stop you making babies or dying. They can't do that, but they can control that 55% of population growth, which is overseas migration.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Awesome. Okay.
By the way, they can encourage you making babies, and they did that a while ago with the baby incentive, baby incentive recently, which actually did allow and make it easier for people to stop working and have babies.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it is interesting how that impacts later on. Facilities and infrastructure and what you need and where people will be living, and so that's definitely one to watch. So the next thing that I wanted to kind of touch on, one of your points, Michael, is about Brisbane finally getting its time in the sun. So obviously that's where I just recently bought. So I'm very interested to hear why that
please
is the case.
praise my decision.
Is that called confirmation bias?
Yeah, basically tell me I'm right.
Please.
Okay. If we work around Australia in 2018, there's all going to have the same tax rate. We're all going to have the same interest rates. So what's going to drive the markets? And it's going to be local consumer confidence, which is going to relate to their ability to get jobs, keep jobs, be able to afford to buy things, and also population growth, which is going to be affected, will affect the supply and demand equation. In all our capital cities, we're building too many high-rise buildings. There's too many new ones that have come out of the ground, and so that's going to slow down apartments. So in general, houses are going to do better than apartments in our capital cities. Doesn't mean an apartment's a bad investment. I actually don't like apartments, the new ones. I prefer to invest in what I call flats, which are the things that were built in the 60s, 70s, the 2-3 story walk-up ones where you're smaller blocks and you haven't got all the facilities. So if we work around Australia, we're sitting here in Sydney this morning, the Sydney market's run out of steam. It's not going to crash. It's underpinned by all the things we said a moment ago. Instead, it's likely to grow overall, probably between 4 to 6% in 2018. Now, I know that's more than some people are suggesting, and that's going to be based on the fact that in some locations, in some areas, there's still strong demand for good houses and investment-grade properties. So A-grade properties are still selling really well in Sydney, with a shortage of them compared to the number of people who want them. But secondary properties on secondary main roads, not as good location, not as good walkability, further out, or the lower socioeconomic areas, they're suffering. Because in the inner city areas of Sydney, people have still got their jobs, they're still getting married, they're still getting divorced, they're still having babies, maybe not in that order, but basically what's happening is life goes on, they're making money, so that people are buying houses. But in the outer suburbs where wages growth isn't much and there's some instability in maybe some of the blue-collar areas, those areas are not going to do as well.
Interesting.
Melbourne, townhouses, villa units are going to outperform apartments, again, for the reasons we said a moment ago. And I think Melbourne will be one of the, if not best performing market next year at probably 6 to 10% growth over 2018. I think Sydney, you will also find, as I said, better growth at the end of the year. It'll do better than the prices at the beginning of the year. Now, Brisbane's market has underperformed year after year after year, despite lovely accommodation, lovely lifestyle, good weather, cheaper prices, half the price. That means people don't go and live there or buy there because prices are cheaper. They're only going to move there if they've got jobs and they can afford to buy. And Queensland, there's not one Brisbane market, so there's multiple markets like in every state, and the apartment market, there's significant oversupply. And recently, I was actually rung by a journalist from ABC asking for an opinion on an apartment block that was giving away 3 months rent-free plus $1,000 incentive for tenants.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
To move in.
Wow.
What?
The developer was giving 3 months rent-free if you took a 12-month lease plus $1,000 cash.
That's crazy.
How?
They had they'd sold the apartments, almost certainly, I guess, with rental guarantees. And so, therefore, they may as well put somebody in. And when there's so many new ones around, so in my mind, those apartments will have no capital growth and no rental growth for a long time. And in fact, rentals are falling in certain parts of Brisbane. On the other hand, houses in the inner and middle ring suburbs are doing very well and will continue to do so. They've done okay in the last couple of years anyway. And so I see somewhere between 3 and 6% growth. But again, not every property, but there's some suburbs that have done well. And so Brisbane's a good market where you can buy a house for the price you'd buy an apartment in Sydney. Hobart was the best performing capital city in 2018, and I believe it's going to do really well again in the best performing market in 2017, and I believe it's going to be the best performing market or one of them in 2018. But don't invest there. See, what's happening is people are going to chase the hotspots, and now Hobart's the hotspot. The trouble is it's a really, really small market. I believe there was something like 5,000 transactions there all of last year.
Wow.
If you think about it, Sydney did that in 1 month.
Yeah.
So therefore, it doesn't take a lot of speculation to push up a small market. But there's got to be a lot of underlying growth drivers. And while there are some, in my mind, it's too small a market to consider being involved in the long term. Lovely place to vacation, great place to live, but that's not where most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to live in Hobart.
That's what actually scared me off investing in there in Hobart, was just that how I was like, I obviously have very limited knowledge of these things, but I thought it's just so small and I just couldn't see how long term,
Yeah. And the young people leave Hobart to get jobs in the big smoke.
Right, yeah.
Sure. Canberra's been a really, really good performing market. It's a quiet achiever. It's been consistent and it's done very well. It's performed steadily, and I think it'll do much the same again, 4 to 7% growth, depending on where you are in Canberra in 2018. If you want to live there, that's great. But interestingly, though, Canberra has very much higher land taxes. And it's not a reason not to buy, but it actually is a disincentive for investors where your total returns are much less. So even though capital growth will be good, if you look at the total blend, I'd actually be looking elsewhere. Adelaide, lovely city, are likely to continue to underperform because I know they're building some submarines or something there. But it's not enough to give good growth drivers. The Perth market's had a terrible couple of years, and it's very likely to be near its bottom. But it's unlikely to see strong capital growth for 2, 3, 4 years yet. The market doesn't turn around as quickly as that. So when it nears the bottom, people who are holding off selling because prices are falling, people who are holding off buying because prices are falling, both start coming in the market, more buyers, more sellers, and they soak up the stock that's there. And so there's usually a few years before that overhang gets carried or taken up before it moves forward. So probably not much more hurt for people in Perth, but not time for counter-cyclical investment play there yet. Darwin has very few long-term growth drivers, and I think people who are considering investing in Hobart should look at the lesson from Darwin, which was a hotspot of a number of years ago.
I do remember that, yeah.
Everyone thought it was fantastic and it did really, really well and was one of the best performing markets for a couple of years. And now, year after year, it's dropped because that short-term impetus has gone and it didn't have enough legs, enough pillars to support it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, going back to Perth, because I don't sort of really remember the property market in Perth before I started here at Finder. So, has there been a period where Perth was doing really well recently?
There was a period when house prices in Perth were almost the same price as Sydney.
Wow. Actually, yeah, I have read that. Yeah, that's crazy.
That is crazy.
Because people were coming from Perth to Perth because the mining boom was creating jobs. Anyone who could pick up a broom could go and sweep the floors in a mining town and get $150,000 a year as a fly-in, fly-out worker. You didn't have to be a skilled labourer, which meant the people the young kids who graduated from school or uni in Perth didn't take the jobs there. What they did was they went off for the adventure in the mining town. So other people had to come in to work in the stores and the 7-Elevens and things like that. And they had to pay them high wages because otherwise they'd go off elsewhere as well.
Right.
And so everyone got high wages and everyone was excited and it was really good. And there was strong growth, but people had all this income. So they bought properties and they got enthusiastic. And then as it died down, their incomes have dropped and Perth got ahead of itself. It's still a big city and it's got good long-term prospects, but it just got ahead of itself too far, too fast.
I mean,
Interesting.
I wonder if, it's just so interesting if you could see that coming, really.
Yeah, I know. If only we had a crystal ball.
Well, how do you have that? And the answer is perspective. You've got to have done it for a long time, been there, seen that. So when people come to our team at Metropole to help them get property strategic advice or act as a buyer's agent, our buyer's agents in Sydney have been in the market for many years as selling agents before now buyer's agents. Same in Melbourne, same in Brisbane. So they can tell why one house is better than the other, why one side of the street is better than the other, why one area is going to do better than the other. And you can't get that on the internet. That's the market learning fee you're going to have to either pay or pay somebody to help you. So the concept is you can see it coming by having lived through it and made the mistakes before.
Yeah.
Yeah, mistakes really are some of the best lessons you learn.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay.
As long as you get through.
Yeah. As long as you don't just stop there.
Yeah.
All right, Michael. So in terms of the next kind of forecast for 2018 and trends, you did mention, that people are going to be really selective in quality, specifically, primarily because there's so many markets and there's all these different factors. And so maybe, we could explore that.
Well, over the last couple of years, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, there was a fear of missing out. We spoke about it at our last podcast. Everyone wanted to get in the market. I'm just going to buy anything. So you do anything rather than... And you know what? The rising market covered you. And I think Warren Buffett said a rising tide lifts all ships, but I think he also said that when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked.
What a great quote.
That's an awesome one.
So basically what happens is those people who didn't have a strategy, who didn't have a plan, or those who bought a secondary property are now going to suffer. So as there are fewer buyers and more sellers, the market's going to move around a little bit. Buyers are now going to have choice. They're not going to have as much competition, and those who are smart and savvy are going to have, and it happens every cycle, a flight to quality. So currently, as I said a moment ago, A-grade properties are still going well. Houses, but B and C grade properties, you're hardly getting anybody at auction or no bidders, and much the same in investment grade stocks too. Good investments are, but investment grade is different to investment stock. So investment stock is those things we talked about before, the big high-rise apartments where they're built for investors. To me, investment grade is something that's going to have a wide appeal to owner-occupiers, not investors, because owner-occupiers are underpinned the market. That's going to have a bit of a twist, a bit something special and different about it, that's going to be in the right location. And I like properties to which you can add value. So something we haven't discussed this at the moment is that even though capital growth isn't as strong, you can manufacture your own capital growth by doing some renovations or development. So rather than the market doing the heavy lifting, you can do it.
That's right. That's actually a really good point. And it's something that oftentimes doesn't get spoken about enough for investors. Okay, and then the sort of the last point that I wanted to touch on was, so one of your kind of trends for 2018 is that you think that more property investors will actually remain on the sidelines, which is really interesting. Just after speaking about this whole FOMO feeling that's going around?
Well, most investors, it's human nature, are most comfortable, confident when the property market's booming, when in fact they should be the most careful. And they are the least confident and most despondent down the bottom of the cycle when in fact there's better opportunities. That's human nature. So we currently are experiencing, so we see clients in our 3 offices, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, and our Sydney clients or prospective clients are currently much more nervous than the Brisbane ones who are feeling upbeat because it's doing well, the Melbourne ones who are upbeat, because Sydney is currently scared because for 5 years the news was boom, my houses are going up, every Monday morning there's the auction clearance rates, and it's the transition in the media to mixed sentiment or negative sentiment. In Brisbane there's been poor sentiment for 3, 4, 5 years, but they were used to it and they weren't scared by it, and you get on with it. But it's the change in sentiment, the mixed messages you get as the cycle turns. That's what
the uncertainty.
The uncertainty that is making people think, oh, did I make a wrong decision buying? They're wondering, should I sell? Should I buy? Should I just wait to see? Because with the predictions of significant property drops, they think, well, I'll wait for the bottom. The thing is, though, that during the global financial crisis, properties didn't drop much at all, and some didn't drop at all, and others dropped 3, 4, 5%. And if it drops that much in Sydney, you're only back to where it was last January. The other thing is, in 2002, 2003, again, the Sydney market had a really long downturn. It went down a bit, 8%, but over 18 months. And that was after the huge boom after the Olympics and after a whole lot of other factors that drove it above its mark. So there's no crash imminent at the moment because we haven't got the high interest rates. So it's a good time in my mind to go out when there's less competition and buy that property you would have had to fight harder for a year ago. But that's not human nature. Human nature is to wait for everybody to tell you, all the green lights are right, you can go.
Pretty much what's happening with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Which is, like now I'm hearing people that are close to me are like, okay, I'm buying Bitcoin. Whereas, 6 months ago it was like, oh, did you hear about Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Now it's like, oh, I just bought Bitcoin. I'm like, okay, this is crazy now. Yeah. So it's very interesting. Okay, well, Michael, I think we've probably run out of time today. We've had a really awesome chat. So many helpful tips in here for listeners. So we might have to have you in a third time to complete our proposed plan of chatting about Rich Habits, Poor Habits, which I actually finished reading and found so helpful. I really wanted to touch on a few things in this conversation, but I think we've probably gone over time.
It'll be my pleasure. Look forward to coming back, Mark, on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, there's lots of information in that show, wasn't there? I'm sure you can see why I allowed it to go on longer than the normal episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you got great information from it. Why not listen again? And I look forward to having a chat with you again this time next week.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect and pass on their wealth through strategic property advice. If you got value from listening to this podcast, please leave us a review and we'll read it out on a future show. Just go to michaelyardneypodcast.com/review and it will take you over to iTunes where you can enter a review and let us know what you think. We'd really appreciate it. If you don't already subscribe on iTunes or on your Android phone, you'll find us there as Michael Yardney Podcast. If you'd like to gain instant access to the show notes or a transcript of the show, head across to michaelyardneypodcast.com. Watch out for our show next week. You'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 20 minutes.